YouTube. My name is Jack, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the responsibilities of priesthood, what priesthood means in the context of initiatory Wicca, and then specifically the responsibilities of coven leadership in an initiatory Wiccan context. It is a thing that you will often hear people say that initiatory Wicca is a priesthood without a laity. So, as a Gardnerian initiate, I am consecrated as a priest of the gods that I serve. That is part of what it is for me to be a Wiccan, to be an initiate of this specific tradition, and then more broadly, just to be a witch, right? That is my own relationship with what being a witch means for me. I am not saying that in order to be a witch, someone has to be a priest or priestess of particular deities. But my experience of being a witch is really wrapped up in being consecrated as a priest of these gods. I've talked before about the fact that there is variation even in that. Across Gardnerian Wicca, we see ourselves as a priesthood, but not everyone sees themselves as a priesthood of particular deities. So some people might see themselves as a priesthood of particular mysteries or something like that. But we all consider ourselves a priesthood. I think that is one of the very few universal statements that I am willing to make about Wicca. But because we consider ourselves a priesthood, this question kind of naturally arises about whether there's a laity, right? We think about priesthood in a Christian context, and the priest is the person who stands at the front of the church and performs the ritual while everybody else watches, and then delivers a sermon to tell them what it all means. And that's really not how most pagan groups are structured. Not just Wicca, but pagan groups in general are highly participatory. There's a real emphasis on everyone present being involved in the ritual, contributing in some way, taking an active part in it. And there is generally very little in the way of a sermon or a lecture or, a here's what it all means. You're not passively like sitting in the audience watching and listening to someone explain to you what your relationship with the gods should be. You are actively partaking in a ritual that facilitates direct communion with those gods. And that's a very different model of what priesthood is. If you don't have a laity, if you're not delivering a sermon, or if you're not the only person in the room who's doing the ritual, what does it mean to be a priest? And for this question, there's a really wonderful book by Lora O'Brien, and I don't have that book on my bookshelf because it's a really wonderful book and I gave it to someone and then never got it back. But she has a book called A Practical Guide to Pagan Priesthood. I will link it in the description down below. And in that book, she, I think, makes a really helpful distinction between two types of responsibility that a priesthood typically has. And then she talks about how those responsibilities might apply in a pagan context. And the responsibilities of a priesthood, according to O'Brien, are pastoral and sacerdotal duties. So pastoral duties are the duties where you are taking care of people. This is what we typically think about when we think about the relationship between priesthood or clergy and laity. So any kind of counseling duties, if you think about the role that like members of the Catholic priesthood serve in taking confession, facilitating community events, things like that, as well as maybe delivering a sermon and telling people what it all means, being sort of a source of comfort, being a source of wisdom, like that is part of the purpose that a priesthood typically serves. We'll circle back to that one. The other type of duty that O'Brien describes is sacerdotal duty. And those are the ritual duties that the priesthood typically has. So there are certain rituals that you perform that, depending on what kind of priesthood you're involved in, maybe have to be performed a certain way or have to be performed on a certain calendar. And it is important for those rituals to get done. And you, as a member of the priesthood, are tasked with the responsibility of seeing that they get done. And I think in the context of initiatory Wicca, when we talk about ourselves as a priesthood, we are very comfortable with the sacerdotal part of it, and then we get real fuzzy when we start talking about the pastoral part of it. So let's talk first about the sacerdotal part of it, because I think that is important and matters. There are rituals that need to be done. I am anointed as a priest in the service of particular deities, and there are rituals that have to be done as part of my relationship with those deities. Part of that is for me, right? Part of that is because I get something out of those rituals. Part of that is for the benefit of anyone else that I'm in ritual with. But a lot of it is for the deities themselves. It is, there is a sense of necessity about it. I'm going to talk about Steinbeck. Hi, sweetie. There's a beautiful novel by John Steinbeck called To a God Unknown. This is a novel that nobody reads, but I think it's one of his best. It's certainly my favorite of his. And To a God Unknown tells the story of a farmer who moves from the east coast of the United States out to the Sacramento Valley, because that's how every Steinbeck story starts. And when he moves out there, he begins worshiping a tree on his farm because he becomes convinced that the tree contains the soul of his dead father. It's super pagan. It's a magnificent book. And the big climax of the book, turn away if you don't want spoilers for this Steinbeck novel that's been out for decades, is that this farmer's extremely conservative Christian brother finds his relationship to the tree heretical, and he kills the tree. And that act of sacrilege brings a drought onto the land and effectively kills the farm. And the farmer then has to go on a pilgrimage to try to restore the vitality of the land. It's all very like Jesse Weston from Ritual to Romance, Grail quests. It's so pagan. It's so pagan. But while he is on his quest, he goes, I promise there's a point to this, he goes to the westernmost point of California. And he finds a man there who makes sacrifices every night as the sun sets over the Pacific Ocean. And he and the man start talking, and this man says, I can't give you a reason for why I do this, except that it needs to be done. I do it because it has to be done. I could make up a reason for you. I could tell you that I make sacrifices to the sun so that it will come back in the morning. I could tell you any number of things. But the truth of the matter is there is no reason except that it needs to be done. And then there's this line in this book that has stayed with me ever since I first read the book, where the protagonist says to this man to provide words to this action that you do would be to clothe a naked thing, and the thing is ridiculous in clothes. There are some ritual actions that we perform out of a sense of necessity, out of a sense of duty and obligation, and a feeling that they must be done. And it's not that something bad would happen if we didn't do them. It's just that they must be done. Like, it would be wrong not to do them. And as a member of a particular priesthood, I am charged with performing certain rites in honor of my gods, but then also the relationship there is complicated because there's a lot going on under the hood. But I'm charged with performing certain rites, and I have a sense of necessity. I have a sense of duty, that there are rituals that must be done. These include the Wheel of the Year. I do not miss a Sabbath on the Wheel of the Year unless somebody is dying, because the wheel is so important to me, and it would be wrong. It would feel wrong to me not to meet that ritual obligation. There are other ritual obligations that I have, but I think you get the idea, right? What I'm driving at is that to be an initiate in Gardnerian Wicca is to be charged with certain sacerdotal duties, to be charged with the performance and execution of certain rituals. Different people will interpret that duty differently. Different people will perform that duty differently. So there are lots of people who are performing, the Wheel of the Year, but who are maybe doing it differently than I'm doing it. It's complicated, but they're still meeting the obligation. They're still fulfilling the sacerdotal duty. The important thing is that there is a thing that has to be done. And that is, I think, really at the heart of how a lot of Gardnerians, or at least a lot of the Gardnerians that I have spoken to, think about what it means to be a priesthood as a tradition. When conversations come up about, what does it mean that we all call ourselves priests and there is no laity? The thing that people say over and over again is we are priests to the gods. We are priests because we do these things for the gods, because we are empowered to do these things, because we have the right to do these things, and because we have the obligation to do these things. And no one outside of our tradition has the power, the right, and the obligation to do certain specific rituals in honor of our gods that we do. Well, I don't want to say no one outside of our tradition, because there are very closely related traditions of Wicca, but no one outside of kind of the current of initiatory traditional Wicca. And that's all totally there. That's all 100% there. There is this kind of question mark floating in the air about the pastoral duties associated with initiatory Wicca. And I think that question gets really murky. I think that members of the high priesthood, so broadly speaking here, without getting too much into the weeds, coven leaders have pastoral duties. When you are leading a coven, you are not just in charge of making sure that the ritual happens and making decisions about how the ritual is going to happen and scheduling when the ritual is going to happen. You are also taking care of a group of people. You are walking with those people as they experience transformative, life-altering events, both in a ritual context and outside of it. So you are facilitating ritual experiences for people that fundamentally change who they are and potentially alter the course of their lives. But you're also part of a group with them. I've talked before about the importance of the coven as the fundamental unit of community in the tradition. And I think that coven leaders are charged with maintaining that small-scale community. They're charged with protecting the group dynamic, making sure that if two people in the coven are fighting or have tension with each other, making sure that that gets resolved in a way that isn't going to spill over and damage the entire group. They're also charged with maintaining the welfare of individuals within the coven. And to greater and lesser extents, right? I'm not saying that the high priestess is everyone's mommy, because there are boundaries, and covens consist of adults, and adults are by and large responsible for living their own lives. But the coven is part of your support network. Once you are initiated into a coven, the coven becomes available to you as part of your support network for the things that you go through in your life and for dealing with your shit. It is not your entire support network. It should not be your entire support network, but it becomes a part of it. And the role of the coven leaders is in part to ensure that that's there, to ensure that you have that support available to you. Right? When my father died, my coven was an incredible source of support. That's just an example, a personal example off the top of my head, but it's a thing that happens all the time. And it happens with big things like the death of a parent. It happens with smaller things, like someone is changing a job and that's really stressful, or like just whatever, the things that are going on in your life. Your coven is there with you through all of that. The coven relationship is an intimate one. And part of the responsibility of the high priesthood within that coven is to make sure that the coven is an environment that allows for that kind of pastoral support. Again, this looks very different from one coven to the next. So there might be some covens where there's a lot of like sharing feelings and talking and processing through things. There might be covens where there's less of that, and where the coven really is primarily oriented as a working group that just kind of shows up and does magic and does ritual together. There's a spectrum, it's all legitimate. I'm not trying to say otherwise. What I am saying is that if someone comes to the coven and says, I am at my wit's end, I've been looking for a job for months now, nothing is panning out, let's do magic about this, like, the coven leaders are going to be navigating that. And whatever the boundaries are within the coven leaders are going to handle that situation differently in a way that is appropriate for the boundaries that they've set in that group. But they are still coming up against that situation and encountering it. My initiating high priestess was like night and day. She could flip a switch. Right? She could, because we're all just people. We're all ordinary human beings. Sometimes we're good at listening, sometimes we're bad at listening, but like, you know, we're just people. We're not on a pedestal or anything. But my initiating high priestess had this incredible ability. You could go to her and you could say, I am about to ask you to do the emotional labor of a high priestess. And it was like she flipped a switch. And all of a sudden she would just go into, I mean, she still does, presumably, but I'm not in the group anymore. So, you know, I can only attest to when I was in the group. But she would just go into high priestess mode. And all of the active listening skills would come out. And that's a mode that people can't be in all the time, right? We're all flawed and like none of us can be full-time active listeners. We have to be people with our own lives and our own interiority. We can't just reflect back on everyone. But to have that skill, to be able to say, now I am going to do the active listening. You have indicated to me that you have an emotional need for it. Now we're going to do that. Tell me what's going on. It's an extraordinary skill, and I think it is a really important skill in coven leadership that doesn't always get talked about. It gets talked about a lot in initiatory Wiccan spaces, but I think that sort of the outward facing, like if you're not involved in a coven, you sometimes have this idea that like the high priestess's job is to show up and be the head bitch in charge. And that's true, but there is also an element of like the high priestess and high priest of a coven. And then potentially more experienced initiates within the coven, depending on the dynamic of the individual group. But the high priestess's job is also in part to I don't want to say take care of, because that sounds more forceful than what I'm saying. That sounds more patronizing than what I want to say. But the high priestess's job is in part to care about her initiates, the members of her coven, and their welfare in a spiritual context, but then also just their welfare as human beings. Because those two things do not come apart cleanly. Who you are in your day-to-day life affects who you are when you show up for ritual, and vice versa. And I think that is, to my mind at least, that is the chief way in which pastoral duties show up in the pagan priesthood, in the Wiccan priesthood, I should say, is in the relationship between coven leadership and coven members. Now that is, oh goodness gracious, my computer has timed out. Okay, we're still recording. There are other ways in which people might have pastoral duties. So a lot of people who are really actively involved in like the wider pagan community or the wider Wiccan community might see it as a responsibility to give back to the community in some way, whether that's by leading workshops or volunteering to do like cooking and cleaning and whatever at pagan events, or like there are tons of ways in which people fulfill that kind of pastoral duty. But in my mind, and maybe this is just because I don't like engaging with the wider community, the wider pagan community, the wider Wiccan community, or the wider Gardnerian community. I'm a hermit. I moved to Utah where there are no Gardnerians. But to my mind at least, the primary pastoral duty in a Wiccan context is the duty that we have toward our coven and toward maintaining the coven as an environment that is safe, that is welcoming, and that facilitates the well-being of its members. And that responsibility falls more heavily on the coven leaders than on other members of the coven, but I think to a lesser extent, it does apply to everyone within the coven, right? We are all showing up to our coven with the intention of co-creating a meaningful communitarian space. So yeah, I had thought this was going to be a short video, and it is not. Those are my thoughts, broadly speaking, about what it means when people say that Wicca is a priesthood. We have both sacerdotal and pastoral duties. The sacerdotal duties are that there are rituals that need to be done, and I think, at least in a certain context, we are the only ones who have the power, right, and obligation to do those rituals. And then the pastoral duties, at least in my mind, have to do with the cultivation of the coven as a space where initiates feel safe and where initiates can come to the coven as part of their support network for the things that they have going on in their lives. So I am gonna wrap it up here. It is past my bedtime. I'll post this video tomorrow. Thank you for watching. As always, a happy new year to all of you, and I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.